Most of the people I have met who have converted to Eastern Orthodoxy from Protestantism typically say that the reason why they converted was because they read church history. For me, it was actually reading secular sociology that, probably more than anything else, convinced me to join a historic denomination. In my last episode, I explained this concept of social imaginaries and contrasted them with worldviews. Worldviews are the more conscious, thought out, explicit systems of thought that we affirm. The social imaginary is essentially, as the name suggests, how we imagine ourselves within our social world. It consists of implicit assumptions, ideas, and values that help us understand ourselves in relationship to other people. It's less philosophical and more lived and intuitive. It precedes philosophy. It's embedded in our everyday practices, our social expectations, and shared cultural narratives. Social imaginaries consist of thoughts and feelings that are often unconscious to us. What really opened my mind to orthodoxy was a book that was not about Eastern Orthodoxy at all. In fact, I'm not sure the author even mentions orthodoxy. The book is called A Secular Age by Charles Taylor. One of the questions that the book sought to answer was one that I have been interested in for a very long time, which is, why was it so easy, so intuitive for people to believe in God before modernity? And why is it so hard for us today to believe in God? Why is it that it took more mental labor to be an atheist before the 1500s, and now it seems to take an enormous amount of mental labor just to be a Christian today? Our materialist cultural narrative usually explains this by saying, well, everyone believed in God because they didn't have science. But now that we can explain how the world works without a God, it's harder to believe in him. That explanation is a case study of specious reasoning. Superficially attractive, but intellectually incredibly weak. The pursuit of naturalistic scientific explanations of reality were set in motion by a Christian desire to know God through the ordered cosmos that he had put into place. There has been in Western civilization pursuits of actual scientific knowledge that uplifted the souls of scientists and deepened their faith in God, exemplified through the classic figures of the field such as Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton. The important variable at play was not increasing material specificity of the cosmos, but an imagined social world that was interpreting the scientific enterprise. It was not about the discovery of objective facts, in other words, but was the internal social changes within the human mind that made a world without God conceivable. People who are putting forward that kind of simplistic answer haven't really appreciated the depth of the question. I have felt myself, and talked with many others who have felt similarly, that faith today often takes a level of arduous work that's really historically unprecedented. I remember thinking one day, after rigorously and honestly exploring the arguments for and against the existence of God, that I really did sincerely believe that supposing a God best explained reality as I saw it. My mind was completely convinced, yet my heart really had a hard time acting as if that was true. It seemed like every time I wanted to act like a Christian, I had to run myself through all of the syllogisms, all of the evidence, and convince myself every single time I wanted to pray or pursue virtue that it was all true. Belief in God, even though it rationally made sense to me, it was not intuitive in practice, but seemed to go against my internal hardwiring. I was not so naive to believe that maybe meant that I wasn't actually true. For the majority of people who live on this planet right now, and for the majority of the people who lived in the world before me, this immense mental barrier just did not exist. It was not derived from my external beliefs, but from my unconscious social programming. When I interpreted the things and people around me and imagined my social world, I was not doing so intuitively within a theistic framework, but within an atheistic material one. And I think that this is true not just for people who grew up atheistic and agnostic, but for people who grew up in most Protestant denominations, with maybe the possible exception of charismatic churches. Now, Charles Taylor examines the complex evolution of the Western social imaginary and all of the major shifts in thinking, beginning in the High Middle Ages, that led to this. This is closely associated with the concept most famously laid out by the sociologist Max Weber called disenchantment. This is a changing social imaginary from one that sees the world in a way that is mystical, laden with spiritual meaning, and one that is that is alternatively devoid of these meanings. Taylor argues that one of the defining features of disenchantment is a shifting view of the self. He says that for most of human history, the mind has been porous, but now it is buffered. Let's unpack that. Before the modern age, people believed that meaning existed within the world independently of the human mind. Remember this because it's super important. Meaning existed in the world independent of the human mind. Places and things had a moral and spiritual value inherent to them. There might be some ancient ruins a few miles away from your city that are cursed. There is a negative moral aspect to that place, regardless of whether or not anyone saw it or interacted with it. Alternatively, there might be a spring of water that is blessed. The water has a meaning associated with it of being blessed implicitly, without you ever having to know it does or interact with it for that to be the case. If you do interact with it, its value is transmitted to you. In other words, there is this mystical residue, or maybe you could say electric charge, whether positive or negative, that everything had inherently. Your mind, in the pre-modern conception of things, was thought to be porous, therefore taking in the meanings of objects and places and people without you even having to think about it. These positive and negative charges would transfer to you, because your mind was like a sponge being influenced by the spiritual reality that you were embedded in. You actually see this way of thinking everywhere in the Bible. Both of the examples I just used are actually from the Bible. The ruins of Jericho were cursed and the pools of Bethesda were blessed, meaning that they had this independent spiritual value that would influence those who would interact with them. Obviously, these spiritual values are not independent from God and the other suprahuman beings who exist in the spiritual realm, but are independent from the human minds that may or may not be interpreting them. When I was a Protestant, I thought that a lot of the stuff that Catholics and Orthodox Christians did was irrational superstition. They would venerate the bones and clothes of saints, and to me that just seemed like empty-headed paganism, until I started to read about the thought world of pre-modern Christians. And then I started to realize something. They actually did all of that because the ancient denominations like the Catholics and the Orthodox were following the example of the Bible. For example, in 2 Kings 13:21, a dead man who was being buried touched the bones of Elisha and was brought back to life as a consequence. The saintly person's physical body had a spiritual value to it, as if it was a positive electric charge that was transmitted to the deceased man's corpse, and the spiritual power that existed, independent of any thinking individual's mind, transferred to the deceased and made him alive. You see this happen when the unnamed woman in Mark 5 touches Jesus' clothes, and the text of the gospel literally says that power went out from him and into the woman, healing her instantly. It is the same phenomenon. People in the ancient world understood this intuitively. That's why Mark 6:56 says, "And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces, and besought him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well." Lest you think this is only Jesus and the strange one-off case of Elisha, it also happens with St. Paul as well. Acts 19 verses 11 and 12 says, "And God did extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that the handkerchiefs or aprons were carried away from his body to the sick, and diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out of them." Paul, being a holy man, had this inherent spiritual power, and this gave him what I am metaphorically comparing to a positive electric charge that would rub off and bless people who came into contact with him, or items that had touched him. In Orthodoxy and Catholicism, this practice never stopped, because the Church, by means of God's grace, never stopped producing holy men, and because their imagined social world never became disembedded from the one expressed by the people of the biblical world. Compare this porous sense of self with the modern impression, which Taylor calls the buffered self. For the buffered self, meaning does not exist independently implicit in people, places, and things, but it's a product of a thinking human mind. You create the meanings within yourself. Your mind is an island isolated from the outside world. The only things that affect you are the things you choose to let in. In this view of reality, there are no blessings or curses unless your mind chooses to give them psychological power. But they do not have that power in and of themselves. That power is given to them by the individual mind. This can be seen, in my opinion, most clearly and emphatically in Martin Luther. I want to do another episode in the future where we actually do a close reading of Luther's theology, because he has this reputation as a legendary exegete of Paul that's completely overstated, in my opinion. His views, when actually examined closely, are actually very idiosyncratic and exegetically creative. I'll just briefly outline some of them here. The central fixture of Luther's theology comes from an idiosyncratic reading of Paul. He establishes a distinction between the inner man and the outer man based on his interpretation of Romans 7. He builds up from this, supposing that the reason why Paul speaks about salvation coming through faith and not through works of the law is because faith and salvation are attained through the workings of the inner man and not the outer man. In other words, the message of God for Luther is preached, and it is heard by the immaterial inward person, leading from a state of disbelief into a state of belief. That condition of belief is what gives a person union with Christ and effectuates salvation. The outer person, the physical body, cannot have any effect on that inward condition of belief, so it's irrelevant to your salvation. It can actually create a disadvantage if adding up a bunch of religious works creates pride within you. Luther is, in my opinion, one of the chief architects of the buffered self. It was not his creation, to be clear. The philosophical trends preceded him, but his theology of sola fide is their fruition. His theology is the ultimate buffered self. The only thing that truly matters is ensuring an internal disposition of faith. It is striking to see that Luther also begins critiquing the historic practices of the Church that did not fit within his sola fide paradigm. Rather than venerating and praying to saints for supernatural physical help, one should instead, according to Luther, seek to just imitate their inward disposition of faith. The external aspects of spirituality were subordinated to the task of tending to the internal world. Even though Luther does not himself diminish the sacraments, I think that the theological framework he established made it conceivable to disregard any important physical component to the Eucharist beyond edifying symbol that increased internal faith. Luther seems to be an intellectual predecessor to René Descartes, who famously expressed the modern buffered self with his completely inward shift expressed by his famous dictum, "I think, therefore I am." The forging of the buffered self was a major constituent element of this process of disenchantment. Today, most people imagine themselves as atomized, isolated individuals. They don't imagine themselves as embedded within a network of spiritual meanings that are constantly exerting their influence upon them. Even the most committed Christians in the Protestant West do not think of themselves as embedded within the social imaginary. They usually imagine themselves as autonomous individuals operating within a divinely orchestrated cosmos that is unfolding like a watch that has been carefully wound up and set into motion. It's still a religious narrative that they are within, but it is a disenchanted one. With this sociological context in mind, I want to ask the question, what does it mean for something to be a symbol? I want to make the argument that the answer to this question depends on your cultural context, and the implicit assumptions about reality assumed within that context's social imaginary. I'm going to propose 3 different answers based on 3 different contexts. The first context, I'm calling the disenchanted context. A symbol to the average modern person is just a mere metaphor. When someone says the color black at the funeral is a symbol of death and grief, we do not read any deeper meaning into that statement. We observe the symbol, being the black garb, and then we internally apprehend its referent, which is mortality and its emotional weight. To someone living in the West before modernity, and to the many people living in the majority world outside of the West today, there is something deeper that takes place within symbolism, specifically when it is within a religious context. This has been observed by innumerable anthropologists, such that it is pretty much taken for granted in the study of religion that for most cultures there's a belief that when the religious ritual is taking place, the symbols actually mystically participate in the reality that they are meant to be symbolically portraying. If a tribal priest puts on the mask of a spirit, his identity fades behind the spiritual being he is portraying, and he and all of those around him believe that he actually becomes that thing he is meant to portray. The Dutch historian Johan Huizinga in his book Homo Ludens, I butchered that name, I apologize, he says, when a certain form of religion accepts a sacred identity between two things in a different order, say a human being and an animal, this relationship is not adequately expressed by calling it a symbolical correspondence as we might conceive this. The identity, the essential oneness of the two, goes far deeper than the correspondence between a substance and its symbolic image. It is a mystic unity. The one has become the other. In his magic dance, the savage is a kangaroo. This is a ubiquitous anthropological observation. We see it underlying the logic of human sacrifice in Aztec society. The human victims chosen for the ritual were identified based on how similar their personalities and physical qualities were to the deity that they were to be dramatically impersonating. When the ritual took place, it was not that they were merely play actors pretending to be a god, as one might find in Greek tragedy, but they were believed to actually become the gods that they are portraying. The ritual was mythos made incarnate. The implications were therefore cosmic, serving to maintain the divine order on the earth. One kept the continual cycle of the cosmos in order by mystically repeating the myth that maintained the divine order on the earth. The myth was continually performed again and again to keep creation functioning. The boundary between the realm of the divine and the realm of human beings was made permeable, as did the boundary between symbolic referent and the symbol. The sacrificial participants were not just representations of the gods, but the gods themselves in human form. This is closely associated with the concept of sacred time as well. In the modern secular West, we think of time as exclusively linear. Our calendars, our clocks, and systematic work schedules have dramatically altered our understanding of time. We think of time only as measurable increments proceeding consistently one after another infinitely into the future. Ancient people had a different worldview. They did not live in a world governed by clocks and 9-to-5 jobs. While they did have calendars and observed consistent intervals of the sun, moon, and stars, they were able to conceive of time as not linear, but oscillating. What I mean by oscillating is that a person moves from normal time into sacred time in regularly repeating intervals. Sacred time is not time as humans measure it, but as it participates in God's eternal present, outside of the limits of past, present, and future. Through religious rituals, people leave the regular linear passage of time and enter into an eternal moment. The word secular actually comes from the distinction between this linear time and sacred time within the Christian calendar. Sacred time was the feast and fast days of the church, while secular time was everything else. In the Jewish tradition that Jesus and the disciples were a part of, on Passover they recited a liturgy. In the liturgy, the people said not that God had delivered their ancestors from slavery, but that God had delivered them from slavery in Egypt. In the Passover liturgy, the people mystically left their regular time period and entered into the eternal moment of the Exodus. They united themselves to that time and to those people. It must be noted that God said to the Jews in the Bible regarding the Passover, "This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall observe it as an ordinance forever." When the Jews remembered the Passover, they did not merely abstractly call it to mind, but mystically united themselves to that sacred time. The ancient Christians followed this same manner of thinking. They established a liturgical calendar, and on different holidays left secular time and entered into eternal moments from the life of Christ. On Theophany, the holiday celebrating the baptism of Christ, the Orthodox bless bodies of water and believe that the waters they bless become mystically connected to those waters sanctified by Christ's baptism in the Jordan. They believe that they are transported out of ordinary life and brought into the Jordan River of the first century. This belief was held from the very beginning concerning the Eucharist. As I previously mentioned, the concept of sacred time and an eternally present moment was already implicit in the Passover traditions that Jesus and the disciples participated in. It was a seamless move for Jesus to add another dimension of meaning to the Paschal meal. The disciples would be partaking of the broken body and shed blood of the cross before it ever even happened. When they continued this tradition of the Last Supper, they were transported back in time to Golgotha, when the body was broken and the blood was spilled. This concept of sacred time is inseparable from this concept of mystical religious symbol. When the religious ceremony begins, the participants leave normal linear time, and then the physical aspects of the ritual become imbued with their mystical associations. The mystical symbols become one with the things that they represent. Here's how St. Cyril of Jerusalem describes the Eucharist. Since then he himself declared and said to the bread, "This is my body," who shall dare to doubt any longer? And since he has himself affirmed and said, "This is my blood," who shall ever hesitate, saying that it is not his blood? He once in Cana of Galilee turned the water into wine akin to blood. And is it incredible that he should have turned wine into blood? When called into a bodily marriage, he miraculously wrought that wonderful work. And on the children of the bride chamber, shall he not much rather be acknowledged to have bestowed the fruition of his body and blood? He continues, "Consider therefore the bread and the wine not as bare elements, for they are, according to the Lord's declaration, the body and blood of Christ. For even though sense suggests this to thee, yet let faith establish thee. Judge not the matter from the taste, but from faith be fully assured without misgiving that the body and blood of Christ have been vouchsafed to thee." This is from On the Mysteries, Book 4. The standard way of thinking about religious symbols, as represented by the overwhelming majority of ancient Christians, fits perfectly with the ubiquitous religious psychology of pre-modern societies. Here are the comments of Herman Bavinck, the Dutch Calvinist theologian, on this in his classic Protestant book, Reformed Dogmatics. The symbol and the thing symbolized were much more intimately bound up with each other in the Eastern mind than in the Western. As Harnack rightly remarks, we understand by a symbol something that is not what it symbolizes. But at that time, people tended to regard a symbol much more as something, in some sense, also what it symbolizes. The burden of proof is actually not on those who hold to the traditional Eucharistic position to show why the Eucharist is the real presence. The thought worlds of antiquity seem very clearly to assume that when someone says something like, "This is my body broken for you, this is the cup of the new covenant, do this in remembrance of me," in the middle of a ritualistic meal, the default interpretation of that language would have been mystical. If you're going to propose an alternative interpretation, you're going to have to give clear biblical evidence that shows that when Jesus said this, he actually meant a disenchanted modern Western interpretation of symbol as metaphor functioning within secular time. Just to save you the time, there is not any biblical evidence that even remotely approaches that burden of proof. That is why almost every single Christian whose writings we still have preserved say basically the same thing as Cyril of Jerusalem, who we quoted above. Here's just 3 more important examples. Here's the words of Ignatius of Antioch, a disciple of the actual apostles in the early 2nd century. "I have no taste for corruptible food, for the pleasures of this life. I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, who was the seed of David, and for drink I desire his blood, which is love incorruptible." That's from his letter to the Romans, chapter 7. Another passage says, "Take note of those who hold heterodox opinions on the grace of Jesus Christ, which has come to us, and see how contrary their opinions are to the mind of God. They abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer because they do not confess that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ, flesh which suffered for our sins and which the Father, in his goodness, raised up again. They who deny the gift of God are perishing in their disputes." That's from his letter to the Smyrnians, chapter 6. Irenaeus, in the latter part of the 2nd century, says, quote, "For as the bread which is produced from the earth when it receives the invocation of God is no longer common bread but the Eucharist, consisting of 2 realities, earthly and heavenly, so also our bodies, when they receive the Eucharist, are no longer corruptible, having the hope of the resurrection to eternity." Athanasius, the same guy who gave us the official New Testament canon, says in the 4th century, "The great Athanasius in word to those being baptized. You will see Levites bringing bread and a cup of wine and placing them upon the table. And as long as supplications and entreaties have not yet happened, there is simply the bread and the cup. But after the great and wonderful prayers have been said, then the bread becomes body and the cup the blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. And again, let us come to the completion of the mysteries. this the bread and this the cup, as long as prayers and supplications have not yet happened, it is simply what it is. But if the great prayers have been said and the holy supplications have been sent up, the word, halogos, descends into the bread and cup and becomes his body. This is clearly the mainstream interpretation of the Eucharistic elements in the ancient world. Now, I remember when I was a Protestant, I always was told that there were actually some people who upheld a symbolic view of the Eucharist in church history too. It was not all real presence, but this assertion is actually incredibly deceptive historically. And now whenever I hear someone say that, it makes me incredibly frustrated because it actually neglects the historical reality. First of all, as our survey of premodern social imaginaries should have made clear at this point, just saying the bread and wine is symbol does not in and of itself mean that it is not also the real presence. Pre-modern people did not interpret the word symbol in the same way that modern disenchanted Westerners do. They were, actually, more prone, specifically in context of religious ritual, to think of symbols as being mystically participating in the reality of the thing they were symbolizing. The use of the word symbol, absent any other context, actually should be taken as the normative mystical perspective, not a mere metaphorical perspective. But there are actually two church fathers for whom a mere symbol view of the sacraments actually might be expressed. There is an enormous caveat that must be mentioned. The fathers in question are Clement of Alexandria and Origen of Alexandria, whose writings don't explicitly deny the real presence, but they really do seem to lean that direction. What do these men have in common? Obviously, they were from Alexandria. What philosophical movement was in vogue in 3rd century Alexandria? Neoplatonism. The city was a hub for Platonic philosophy, and it is well known that both of these church fathers were heavily influenced by Platonic thought. The reason why these fathers seemed to move away from a real presence view was not because of fidelity to the Bible, but because of a commitment to a Platonic view of reality, in which everything on earth was a pale shadow of the true heavenly reality. This was the same philosophical presupposition that produced the Christological heresies that denied the true humanity of Jesus. These fathers did not take it that far, but they did buy into the major assumptions of that perspective, and as a result seemed to interpret the Eucharist as a Platonic typological representation of the true Jesus who is in heaven. So really the correct assessment of the historical picture was that 1. The majority of the ancient church unambiguously affirmed the real presence, believing religious symbols to mystically participate in the reality of the thing being signified. And 2. The minority view that seems to be associated with an overt philosophical commitment to Platonism, which emphasizes the supremacy of heavenly forms and the inability for imperfect physical reality to truly manifest those forms. The thing is, I do not know any Protestants who deny the real presence of the Eucharist because of a philosophical commitment to Platonism. Almost all of them deny it because they hear Jesus say, "This is my body broken for you," and they interpret that according to their disenchanted modern Western biases. So this is the point. One of the most powerful draws for me into a historic faith was not just the theology, but a desire to be embedded in the same worldview, the same social imaginary as the people of the Bible, to become re-enchanted, re-embedded into the social imaginary and thought worlds of the primitive Christians. Because you do not interpret the Bible in a vacuum. You have centuries worth of unconscious philosophical biases that shape how you read the scriptures. If you want to have a good theology, I think that you need to be aware of those things that preceded theology. One of those things being the social imaginary that you belong to, and the one that the authors of the text belong to. You need to be aware of how different those things actually are. The plain reading of the text is not always the same for every person in every time and culture. The idea that any literate person can have immediate access to the text's self-evident meaning is a Lutheran fiction. When the Orthodox and Catholics celebrate the Eucharist today, we retain that ancient idea that time is not merely linear, as our secular worldview has led us to believe, but that we can mystically join ourselves with moments of eternal significance. When we enter the church, we are entering a slice of heaven. When the words of institution are read, we leave mundane reality and mystically join the disciples at the Last Supper. When we ask the Holy Spirit to transform the body and bread into the flesh and blood of Christ, we find ourselves standing before the crucified Lord. And when we ingest him through the sacrament, we acknowledge the seed of his resurrection body growing inside of us. While these concepts of time and symbol are not explicitly stated in the Bible, nearly every honest historian and sociologist of the ancient world can attest that this was an assumed reality now lost to modern disenchanted man. The biblical authors did not say it because they did not have to say it. Everyone knew that this is how things worked, and centuries of change have made us forget this once self-evident reality. One of the many reasons that I became Orthodox was because I wanted the view of reality that was just intuitively laden with meaning that had been abandoned and forgotten in my own society in favor of disenchanted rationalism. I did not want to have to run myself through a dozen syllogisms to be able to pray. I wanted to just live and breathe Christianity. And this is what Orthodoxy as well as Catholicism have to offer. You have your life re-enchanted, and you can be re-embedded into the continuous narrative of faith as told by the people of the Bible and carried on through 2,000 years of Christian history. If that's something that you're interested in, if you want a world in which there are holy men, miracles, and Christ actually present in the Eucharist, you should find your local Orthodox parish and come see for yourself. Thanks for listening.